It did not begin with a coup, nor with a decree signed in the capital. It began with a woman, a building, the hum of machines breaking the silence of Kdogo. For generations, Africa's most fertile soils were treated as empty bowls, waiting for ships that carried grain from elsewhere. Rice, the food of the poor and the proud, became a symbol of dependency. Each sack that crossed the ocean whispered the same insult: "You cannot feed yourselves." But then came a defiance carved in steel and grain: Mamunata Baza, a Burkinabe woman, dared to build the largest rice processing plant on the continent. 400 tons a day, not funded by donors, not stamped with foreign logos, but built with her own people's hands. And beside her, not as a general issuing orders, but as a leader shaping destiny, stood President Ibrahim Traoré. Together, they lit a fire that no storm can extinguish. The question now echoes across villages, parliaments, and even the boardrooms of the West. Is this the moment Africa stops waiting and starts building? Stay with us, because this isn't just another story. It's the future our ancestors dreamed of. Subscribe and walk with us for an Africa that never bows again. There is a wound that runs deep across the African soil. It is not carved by bullets, nor written in treaties. It is the silent wound of hunger. For decades, a continent that once fed empires was told it could not even feed itself. Burkina Faso, or Burkina Faso as elders still whisper, it became a mirror of this insult. In the markets of Ouagadougou, sacks of rice arrived with foreign labels. While the red earth of the Sahel lay idle, every grain imported was not just food. It was a message: you will remain dependent. Statistics spoke like shackles. By the early 21st century, nearly 95% of the rice consumed in parts of West Africa was imported. The very land that once nurtured kingdoms was reduced to waiting for ships, for aid, for approval, and the people paid the price. Families spent fortunes on rice that traveled oceans while their own soil grew weeds. Farmers abandoned their fields, stripped, not of skill, but of dignity. The insult cut deeper still. While African soldiers defended their borders with blood, their children ate meals carried across seas, while mothers tilled their gardens. The supermarkets filled with polished bags from Asia and Europe. Hunger was no longer just the absence of food, it was the presence of humiliation. And yet, the land never forgot. The rivers whispered, "We can feed you," the fields sighed, "We are not barren." But year after year, policy failed. Elites bowed, and dependency deepened. The very act of eating became an act of surrender. This was the quiet colonization of the stomach. No chains on the wrists, but chains on the kitchen table. No slave ships, but cargo ships filled with rice. And as long as Africa ate from someone else's sack, sovereignty was just a word, not a reality. But history teaches us this: a wound ignored becomes an infection, but a wound remembered can become a scar of strength. In every family that counted coins for rice, in every farmer who sold land for survival, the memory of betrayal was planted like a seed. And seeds, when pressed deep into the earth, wait for their season. That season began to stir when a generation finally asked the forbidden question: why must we beg for food grown on our own soil? History often changes, not with armies, but with individuals who refuse to bow. In Burkina Faso, that person was not a general in uniform, but a woman with vision and grit: Mamunata Baza. She was not born into wealth, she did not inherit foreign investors. She inherited something stronger: the conviction that her country could feed itself. While others talked of poverty, she saw abundance waiting to be claimed. And in Kdogo, she lifted that conviction into steel and stone. The plant she built was not small. It was the largest rice processing factory in Africa, capable of handling 400 tons a day. 400 tons, each sack not arriving by sea, but rising from the soil of her own people. To many, It was just machinery, but to the farmers, it was a promise. To the youth, it was employment. To the women, it was a mirror that finally reflected themselves as leaders, not followers. Mamunata did not build alone. Standing beside her, guiding policy and protecting the space for such defiance, was President Ibrahim Traore or Traore. As some write his name, he had entered power not as a politician, but as a soldier, yet his greatest battle was not fought with guns, but with seeds and tractors. In 2023, he declared a national agro-pastoral and fisheries offensive, a campaign that many dismissed as rhetoric, but in the dry plains, it became reality. Tractors rolled, land once abandoned was cleared. Idle youth were mobilized, displaced villagers found work not in begging, but in building. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso was not waiting for aid programs. It was launching its own. This was not theory. This was rice sprouting where weeds once stood, and in the heart of that transformation stood the unlikely partnership, a woman entrepreneur and a captain turned president. She provided the vision, he provided the shield. Together, they embodied a truth that no foreign loan could purchase sovereignty. On August 18th, 2025, Minister of State Ismail Sombi visited the Kdogo plant. Cameras flashed. The machines hummed. Women in uniform stood proudly at their stations. It was not a staged performance. It was proof that Burkina Faso was no longer content to be fed. It was ready to feed itself. The symbolism was immense. Farmers now had a guaranteed buyer, and across the villages, hope began to wear a new face, not abstract, not distant, but practical, daily, tangible. This was more than economics. It was a cultural shift. For once, a woman became the nation's hero not for beauty, but for courage. For once, a soldier was honored not for conquest, but for cultivation. And for once, rice was no longer a reminder of dependency, but the taste of dignity. As the hum of machines filled Kdogo, a continent held its breath. Was this the spark? Could one woman, one plant, and one leader truly awaken Africa from centuries of waiting? The fire that began in Kdogo did not stay within the factory walls. It leapt into markets, homes, and hearts. What began as machinery turned into momentum, what began as rice turned into a revolution. In Ouagadougou's markets, polished bags of local rice appeared beside the foreign brands that had long dominated the shelves. For the first time, consumers held in their hands a product not stamped with distant languages, but with their own. It was rice that came from their neighbors, their soil, their sweat, and that simple act of choosing local grain over imported became a declaration: we will eat from our own land. Truckers found stable routes delivering sacks of Produaso rice. Retailers gained new stock. Farmers no longer feared their harvests rotting in silence. They had a guaranteed buyer in Mamunata's plant. And in villages, children watched their parents walk proudly to work, no longer dismissed as beggars of aid, but builders of a new future. For the youth, the change was most dramatic. Those who once eyed Europe through dangerous migration routes now saw opportunity at home. Machine operators, accountants, quality controllers. These were not abstract careers anymore. They were real jobs, with uniforms, with wages, with dignity. A young man who might have drowned in the Mediterranean now clocked into a shift in Kdogo. A young woman who once believed agriculture was a man's world now supervised entire production lines. The effect was contagious. University students debated how to replicate the model with maize, sorghum, or sesame. Villages asked for their own processing units. Elders who had seen only despair whispered to grandchildren, This is different." And beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the whispers grew louder. In Ghana, entrepreneurs urged their government to study the Kdogo model. In Nigeria, Activists pressured ministries to pursue food sovereignty. In Kenya, senators cited the plant during debates, challenging their nation with one piercing question. If Burkina Faso can do this under sanctions and instability, what excuse do we have? Even opposition voices inside Burkina Faso, usually quick to dismiss President Ibrahim Traoré, had to admit something had shifted, for this was not a speech. This was proof, and proof cannot be erased. But perhaps the greatest transformation was not economic or political, it was spiritual. A people who had long been told they could not now believed they could. The hum of machines in Kdogo became the new national drumbeat. It was not a song of despair. It was a rhythm of pride. And so the question spread like wildfire, carried on tongues, prayers, and debates. If one woman, one factory, one grain can awaken a nation, what might awaken a continent? If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. Every victory in Africa echoes beyond its borders, and Kdogo was no exception. The hum of its machines unsettled not just merchants but ministries in Paris, Brussels, and Washington. For decades, food was not just nourishment, it was leverage. Aid agencies dictated policies by offering sacks of rice. Donors controlled governments, not with armies, but with shipments. Hunger was turned into a bargaining chip, and sovereignty was mortgaged for every bag unloaded at African ports. But when Mamunata Baza's plant began polishing local grain, that leverage cracked. Suddenly, Burkina Faso no longer waited for the World Food Program to arrive. It no longer bent to trade contracts written in European offices. It was feeding itself, and nothing frightens the powerful more than a people who no longer need permission. French editorials spoke with unease. They called the Kdogo project ambitious but isolated, hoping to paint it as a curiosity rather than a revolution. Brussels think tanks drafted reports, warning that local processing could disrupt grain import flows across the Sahel. In American policy circles, the tone was cautious but wary. Could this model spread? Would it undermine Western development leverage? Behind closed doors, development agencies adjusted their language. For years, they had preached food security while ensuring dependency. Now they whispered about sovereignty, trying to retrofit their relevance into a movement that had outgrown them. The old playbook money in, compliance out was being shredded by one woman's factory. And yet, their discomfort revealed a deeper truth. If a country like Burkina Faso, under sanctions, instability, and constant security threats, could build a $1 billion rice industry without foreign aid, then what excuse remained for others? International media tried to control the narrative. Some framed it as a regional experiment, others downplayed it, claiming it could not last. But in the villages of Africa, the people heard another message. If they can do it in Kdogo, we can do it here. The West saw a factory, Africa saw a blueprint. The West heard the hum of machines. Africa heard the drumbeat of independence. And so the questions multiplied. What happens when rice is no longer imported by ship but harvested at home? What happens when aid agencies cannot dangle food as leverage? What happens when a farmer in Burkina Faso negotiates not as a beggar, but as a supplier? This is why Kdogo unsettled the powerful, because it revealed that sovereignty is not abstract. It can be milled, polished, bagged, and eaten. It can sit on a family's table and whisper a new truth. We are free. Rice was never just rice. It was control. And now, that control was slipping away. The hum of Kdogo's machines was not just a local sound, it became a continental echo. Across Africa, leaders, activists, and ordinary people began to ask a question once considered dangerous. If Burkina Faso can build for itself, why not us? In the classrooms of Accra, students debated how to create their own processing plants. In the parliaments of Nairobi, senators pointed to Burkina Faso's bold step as proof that food sovereignty could be written into law. In Bamako and Niamey, Youth groups began drafting blueprints for sesame mills and sorghum factories. The contagion was not of disease, but of dignity. This is the essence of Pan-Africanism, not just speeches or conferences, but action rooted in the soil. Thomas Sankara once declared, "He who feeds you, controls you." Decades later, President Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier-turned-statesman, is proving Sankara's prophecy correct. By choosing cultivation over compliance, he is daring to continue the unfinished work of his predecessor. In this new vision, farmers are not relics of the past, but engineers of sovereignty. Women are not bystanders, but leaders. Like Mamunata Baza, who showed that one plant could alter a continent's destiny. Youth are not migrants fleeing across seas, but innovators finding pride in building at home. Burkina Faso, or Burkina Faso as some call it, is no longer just a nation battling terror. It has become a symbol, a pulse, a rhythm beating in defiance of centuries of dependency. Some call it the Burkina Pulse, the heartbeat of a continent remembering its strength. Of course, challenges remain. Terrorism still prowls the Sahel. Sanctions squeeze the economy. Global powers quietly plot to undermine this awakening, but something irreversible has already happened. Once a people taste a dignity, no imported sack can satisfy them again, and so we must ask, is Kdogo merely a factory? Or is it the first chapter of Africa's Great Reset? Will this be remembered as the moment when Africa stopped waiting, stopped begging, and began to rise with its own hands? From one woman's vision, from one leader's courage, from one grain of rice, a blueprint has emerged, a blueprint for an Africa that refuses to bow, refuses to beg, and refuses to be forgotten. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. From hunger to harvest, from dependency to dignity, the story of Kdogo is not merely about rice, it is about memory, struggle, and rebirth. For too long, Africa's soil was treated as barren, its farmer dismissed, its people told to wait for aid ships. That history left scars of anger and generations lost to despair. But then came a woman named Mamunata Baza, and a captain turned leader, President Ibrahim Traoré. Together, they proved that sovereignty can be planted, watered, and reaped. They showed the world that African sovereignty is not a slogan. It is machinery humming in Kdogo. It is jobs created for youth. It is farmers selling to their own people, not to foreign brokers. This moment echoes the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré Sankara leaders who dared to declare that Africa would not bow. It is Pan-Africanism, not in theory, but in practice. The latest reports, the Captain Ibrahim latest news, the Burkina Faso latest news, the headlines across Africa news, and the whispers of the Burkina Pulse all point to the same truth: a shift has begun. Yes, the West is uneasy. Yes, think tanks in Brussels and Paris speak of disruption, but disruption is the language of liberation. And if Ibrahim Traoré Burkina Faso, if Burkina Faso Ibrahim Traoré can build dignity from soil and sweat, then the entire continent has no excuse to remain silent. The question that remains is not whether Africa can rise, but whether Africa will choose to. Will this spark be protected, nurtured, and spread until no village remains dependent, no child remains hungry, no nation remains bowed? Or will history's old enemies, sanctions, sabotage, betrayal, try again to dim this light? That choice belongs not only to leaders, but to us, to those who carry memory, to those who believe that our ancestors' prayers still echo in the wind. If this story moved something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe, because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear. New Africa. Africa rise. Africa can do it. It's time for Africa